Hello everyone, today we talk about Neo-Assyrian siege engines and military engineering. We will not talk about specific military operation, but stick mainly to the iconographic evidence that is provided, especially by the monuments of Ashur-Nasir-Pal, Tiglath-Pileser III, Sennacherib, and Shalmaneser III. And this was an age, as you know, where virtually every large town or city in the Near East, in Egypt, was protected by its own defensive walls. Right? The Assyrians, therefore, could have never created an empire unless they had been remarkably proficient in siege warfare. And there is an approach in historiography that stresses essentially the alleged preference by Assyrians of this, rapid decision in open field to avoid fundamentally bogging themselves down in a siege that they were, however, necessarily willing to do for the aforementioned reason. That was extremely costly, but also the empire was not scared of undertaking even for the major cities. Think about Babylon, Jerusalem, Samaria, Arpad. The sieges lasted for years, right, trying down valuable Assyrian assets that arguably could have been employed elsewhere. But were you an Assyrian king at the time, knowing how to handle the empire better than them, right? It's always been the same old story. There's this sense of maybe somebody in history made a mistake that we would have handled better than them because we know so much better than them how it was, but we should just learn how to listen to the sources, what they have to tell us sometimes. And it is true in part that Neo-Assyrian tactics were designed to encourage the enemy not to retire behind fortified walls, but that is not something you can decide per se, right? Everybody was manning their own fortifications that surely had an extensive strategic purpose, and in fact systematic management for the convenience of an invasion, etc. And while it is true that in the here we are basically already in the Iron Age in part, or late Bronze, whatever you want to define it, the states of the time didn't really have much of a surplus to throw away, right? And the political and social cohesion of these entities was very delicately balanced, in fact, on the military spending and the deterrent capacity that came from it, right? On, in fact, polities like cities that were, of course, always willing to become independent once again, or to autonomize themselves. I already made videos about Assyrian warfare, the Assyrian army, and kind of the general, especially the Neo-Assyrian one, the general transformation on the base of the empire's changing needs. And every army of the time had naturally siege capacities, but the Assyrians were in many ways the first statile armies that we can identify historically. So to actually put together enough resources and managing to control them with an important administration to address also properly in a more functional and more imposing fashion that had never been seen before. The costs of sieges, of course, was great, as you understand, especially in the aforementioned multi-year context, as it's been confirmed archaeologically also for the siege of Lachish against the Jews in 701 BC, where the Assyrians won, but a grave with 1,500 of their soldiers' corpses have been found. This was under Sennacherib, about whom, as we were saying before, we also have the properly iconographic evidence of the siege itself. Actually, in that case, it's quite interesting, as we'll see now, because it documents also, in fact, a functionalization over time of the, in comparison with the other evidence of the properly the assemblage at that point of the siege engines, and that's quite interesting. And naturally the fact was complicated that most cities at that point were had been growing on hilltops, often protected by some natural obstacles, plus like a river, for example, that could just side part of the walls. The Assyrians would go for it even in those cases, and from those sides, as you know, blockading from all sides is crucial, right? Even when it's difficult for the same besieged to, remaining open to the outside through a more difficult route. The Assyrians had even floating siege towers, and there were naturally earthworks all around, and the same besiegers would build others to try, especially to form these ramps over which the siege engines, like rams towers, were sometimes even the same thing, built in the same structure, would advance with a specific paving that was edified as such. It was a very complex methodical work, as most siege warfare practically is, and also a pretty brutal one, as we will see in a while. And we're fortunate to be documented thanks to the same success of the Neo-Assyrian kings that illustrated their military, contemporary military undertaking in bas reliefs with an important degree of detail. And we will see partly also a bit of siege tactics from what we can observe iconographically. That is in many ways most of what we can derive tactical information from these times and places, because there is an important textual evidence also for older times. In fact, we'll probably make a video at some point on a typical Near Eastern siege, right, between, say, the 2000 BC to some 1200 BC. But the details linguistically also are not always clear. If anything, probably from a philological point of view, we don't have the perfect understanding of what certain means. That could be very semantically rich, but in this sense, in fact, generic in a way mean. And whereas the iconography is quite famously, probably for the Neo-Assyrians in particular, very it's crucial for any more detailed understanding. And the objective was naturally storming the city after having caused enough damage to the garrison and to the same fortification, for which we are mostly appreciating the technical side also of these siege engines before else, because these were already by themselves the proof, like, of the most advanced, most powerful military of the time, right, and give us an idea also of how logistically this thing was carried out. We see fixed or mobile siege towers. We can't determine it clearly. Some have wheels, as we will see, so they could move. Definitely others were built statically or floating, as we were hinting at before, equipped with a massive iron shod ram, right, that appear, in fact, for the first time in reliefs during the reign of Ashur-Nasir-Pal. We are from essentially 883 to 859 BC. We know, as we were saying before, that the Near East was not new to such siege engines, albeit the evidence is textual, so we don't really see them, but we can't think that, of course, the thing was much older. In any case, they were somewhat exceptional, and probably, in fact, more advanced, more updated by this more recent times. Such engines appear to have been constructed at the siege itself, right? And one proof of this is that if you look at the pattern of some of them, now I don't know which images are passing by, but say you can see easily that large numbers of infantry shields and sometimes even chariot wheels are used to build them up, to make them, to cover them. And by the reign instead of Tiglath-Pileser III, between that is 745 to 727, the ram developed further, apparently becoming a lighter and more mobile weapon, which is something that actually goes in parallel, seemingly, with most of the Assyrian arming trend, right, towards, let's say, larger amounts of lighter means, right? In part, probably because of a logistical need, because the empire was kind of expanding far and wide, and heavier troops and machines and material in general were more costly logistically, and there were also many more troops that were being provided by tributary states that were not as advanced like the Assyrians, that instead accumulated a lot of loot and wealth, and therefore could also provide for more heavily equipped troops in general. And probably this derives also from some causes that we can't trace, that are probably also just ideological, depending on the relief, etc. But to document this passage from, say, something bulkier to something more agile, in a way that naturally, as you understand, it's relative on the field, because the larger settlement you attack, the bulkier the engine you need, right? So this evidence, albeit kind of rich in relative terms for times and places, not necessarily, descriptive of the reality as a trend in, %, right? And we see these lighter weapons from, in fact, the time of Tiglath-Pileser to the ones of Sennacherib that ruled instead, latter ruling from 705 to 681. And the ram body could be made essentially of 3 sections, front, middle, and rear, that we see properly being stuck together by 2 double rows of toggles. So these short rods of wood are sewn to one side of a panel, or pushed through a hole or hoop, and on the other side, and twisted so as to act as a fastener, right? And the ram body skeleton is covered in leather and made probably of wicker, right? So they are light material, but they were still effective, somewhat effective for technology of the time. And also, this is the point, they're a cover, right? So they don't have to, it's the ram proper that has to be, as we will see now, importantly built. And the latter was there to provide that, say, less flammability to the whole system, that for which just wetting the latter surface was not enough, and especially for not, in fact, setting more easily on fire the wicker underneath, and also providing a minimal level of protection for those who were manning the ram. The latter evidence of the 3 sections is especially provided by the relief illustrating the assault at Lachish at the time of Sennacherib. It's somewhat a lesser detail among the larger engines, better depicted engines in other reliefs, and even on the gates of Balavat, dating to Shalmaneser III. But they're very eloquent, because they show in the most recent time a sort of prepared engine pieces that may have at that point been brought also from the distance, not necessarily built there, and showing this degree of simplification of the siege engine, that appears to be smaller, but also its greater functionality, also thanks to this kind of assemblability, prepared assemblability. What we normally see in the siege engines is that the front was usually taller than the rest of the machine, thus forming a small turret with a window in the front. And this was used, as the iconography shows, to target the enemy ramparts from a position. Could be more or less like, at least in siege warfare in ancient medieval times, it was normally at the same level of the ramparts. Hopefully it would be over that, so to gain some sort of advantage, but naturally this would put further strain to the structure, would make it more costly. So in a sense it was better just for the structure to be kind of more solid, but maybe just at the same height of the ramparts, as to provide for more missile power from there to suppress the resistance, the fire from the same walls, and to allow these stormers to assault the same ramparts, the breaches, whatever. As we'll see now, you know, the thing, of course, as always in sieges, is very varied, right? There is not a standard fortification. There's not even just a uniform fortification. So you can literally break it in part with the same engines, in part with the same pioneers, that sometimes are the same people. See some guys equipped with Neo-Assyrian warfare with massive double-sided axes that were used both in combat and for mashing the fortifications, and especially seemingly as by these assault troops, kind of assault engineers, as we would call them. All great empires had kind of that. The Roman legionnaire conceptually with the Labra was a bit the same idea, and incidentally those guys in the Assyrian reliefs are also well armored usually, so that probably speaks also for this greater exposure to missiles, etc. So there could be all kinds, really, even of siege machinery that we don't see in the reliefs, different size, etc. The typologies probably were similar per se. It's just the size that normally changes, because the functionality is more or less the same. This is what I've studied. It's like when you study, I don't know, medieval warfare, you see still ballistas next to crossbows, right? What's the difference between a ballista and a crossbow? They're basically the same thing, just different in size, right? You know, and the enemy would have also similar means mounted on the ramparts in part. I mean, not this kind of massive things that we will see as ramps that mostly appear, etc., but certain other kind of wood structures that could be used also to higher up the defenses and target the enemy from there. And the front being taller naturally provided some cover also for the rear troops. Sometimes they're depicted on top of the skeleton behind the turret, which tells us also that there was some important stability provided by the structure altogether to have men over it. And the turret is interesting because it's just articulated like other fortification turrets. In fact, you have the windows, even I think, if I remember correctly, in some cases the same crenellated in fact ramparts, like as you see typically in the Near Eastern fortifications at the time. I mean, the needs were the same. The ram was usually moved on 4 wheels, but some early times show 6 even. Mobility is fundamental because you can't just let that ram there, right, and go away and come back later. The enemy will destroy it in the meanwhile. So, you know, it was better like that. Naturally, there were some ramparts and other earthworks that were built in the same proximity of the walls, and those also were manned, etc. So quite complex solutions. Probably some stationary ramp could have even existed, but in general mobility was better also because, as you understand, these were valuable assets, right? They costed, right, even for the army there, that very often would kind of lay waste the surroundings, if anything, for foraging, and would need also the wood and other material for simply fortifying the camp and all these things. The ram itself instead was long, thin, protruding from high up the front of the machine and ending in different forms. from one side we see, especially in the earlier, if I'm not wrong, in the Nasser Pileser reliefs, this almost kind of chisel-like shape of the hand that was stuck in between. It was meant to break into naturally the walls, the stones, and stick in between them. And then they would oscillate in from the other, the bottom end, and so making leverage on the breaking point, trying to smash the to open a greater breach, tearing apart the wall, shifting the bricks and all. Later on, instead, we see instead something more like spear-like, right? And this is again interesting because it does fit mechanically what we saw, generally speaking, as the trend. That is to say, the first bulky machines were probably just built to sit there for a longer time. Therefore, you could have this more sophisticated and kind of longer time taking, but also kind of more effective way of breaking to the walls. The later ones are smaller, so there would be more, and they would probably attack, in fact, multiple layers. We will see there is also a reference to them as by Sennacherib as flies, right? Probably in reference to this lighter form of ram that would just hit more hard, also probably more the perishable material, but that could break in that specific point faster, right, and exhaust itself faster, but also for this more kind of blitz type of operations. In fact, it seems the Assyrians tended, whenever they attacked, they went for attacking a city to make it over with it quickly, right? At least preferentially. They couldn't really decide that just by the strategic contingencies, but these lighter siege engines may speak for that kind of, okay, let's strike now, maybe just even catching the enemy by surprise, and if we get it better, otherwise, we will not stay normally on the longer to try to take the settlement. And again, this does fit with what we've seen with the needs of the the changing operational theaters of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The first were kind of more concentrated in Mesopotamia, where the supply lines were shorter, the main centers were closer, and therefore it was easier to bring bulkier stuff and to be more methodical. Whereas on the frontier, it was very difficult even just to bring troops there, and so the lighter the better, and consequently technology would adapt to the tactical needs. Often the later type of engines are provided with two of such spears, together with a loop which purpose we don't clearly understand. Some have suggested that the ram was thus to imitate an elephant, right, because of the broader meanings that would be attached to this war machines, as always, right up to the Middle Ages and more. You have nicknames given to siege engines, and there was all some kind of specific character attached to them. This is a world where there are not the modern standard categories, right, or not just of linen, of course, but even of Hellenic thought. So every single object is unique in the world and has specific unicity and value and power of some sort. And this also shows, in a sense, the degree of heterogeneity that probably, in fact, this machinery had in general, in spite of the typology still in the way they were practically realized. Consider that herds of elephants still existed in the wilderness regions on the banks of the Euphrates River, right? And they were, in fact, hunted by Assyrian kings too, right? That were deriving this kind of pride from, as you know, mostly in the reliefs, it's lions, the lion hunt and killing, and that would give this supernatural affirmation to this. Animals were sacred in a way. You could think about even the importance of the elephant in Indian warfare in parallel, and the idea that the warrior would tame an elephant being the individual taming this gigantic elephant. It was in the universal creed of the time, everywhere, right? The hero taming the giant, taming the wild animal, taming the barbarian, right? The subject was too inferior to be to rule, and it was to be ruled instead, right? So the ferocious and systematically repressive and imperialistic Assyrian mindset was perfectly in tune with the universal belief of the time. We know of tremendous massacres, of course, carried out by the Assyrians in their campaigns. Sometimes some areas were literally wiped, properly cancelled, right? Everything was destroyed, harvested, population exterminated, and so on. We have the proof that other siege engines attempted to imitate other animals. For example, there is properly a ram imitated on an example, the bronze gate of Balavat, dating to Shalmaneser III. In these cases, the snout of the beast was probably shod in metal to provide a ram, and rams could be used basically against any structure, gates, the same walls as we've seen, so you name them. The size of the crew and how the ram was worked is not really clear. Alright, we just see again these guys, for example, on the top of the towers, some even on top of the posterior part, essentially shooting their bows. Right, so we don't see people, the people underneath, for example, pushing them, and probably there was some kind of outside help, let's put it in this way, that just was not shown necessarily. But it's obvious that if most presumably, in fact, as it would happen also in later times, that this rams and engines, broadly speaking, were pushed under the enemy walls, well, you want to stay under cover. Unless you're not, in fact, an archer, which, by the way, in Assyrian warfare, usually you would be represented like paired. Famously, this is famous and interesting also for later speculation on the use of Babis troops later on. It's in the Middle Ages, paired with shield bearers, properly coupled individually. We don't know from the art whether it was a more complex formation, or some representations seem to show properly separated pairs jumping around, kind of providing this mobile, fluid, flexible, in fact, cover, by the way, because they could kind of advance, retreat, but depending on the situation, which, especially during the approach to the enemy fortifications, is a very important thing, because the objective, again, is to suppress the enemy fire, right? So you have to expose yourself to it in some way, and being covered at least with something mobile in the approach, which can be outside of your own earthworks and palisades. A shield bearer may have to do something like that. And you see, however, still the fact, as it would be obvious too, that some archers were just exposing themselves to the enemy. There is a big deal. So armored archers in Neo-Assyrian warfare, they were surely elite, but as the missile element, if you listen to the videos I made there, was really the prevalent one, right? So very often the collective missile volume can be more important than armor itself, because it simply suppresses the enemy to the point that you're not even exposed to that fire, right? So not necessarily more armored the better. Sometimes you want to be even just more numerically and good enough in terms of what you can provide with your offensive capacities than overly loaded, etc. Naturally, it was a variety of these troops. So we think that troops were under the engine cover, and that others would also operate, as we will see, as pioneers, breaking some dead corners of the enemy walls that was not targeted by enemy fire. You know that some some gates were probably built in a section of the walls that was inward, because so that you could target from the side or even the rear the enemy entering with the engine towards the gate, and it was a quite effective mean, in fact. So very bloody affair, by the way, very traditional, but sometimes also very shockingly, the assaults were at that point naturally carried out, as always, with the greatest concentration of forces everywhere, as not to dilute the enemy resistance just in one sector or the other. Interestingly enough, one archer and a man with a water ladle, right, literally a large, long handled spoon with a cup-shaped bowl, as is used to pour the water on the parts of the ram that were set on fire, showing how frequent this was, probably to mount this extra tool on it, which was already something, because probably the spears themselves, as we see them as part of this ram, were required to perhaps only by 4 men to be operated, right? And the bulkier older types probably had this massive also metal part inside which the ram was attached, because it was really big and it had to be resistant and to hold weight, and also the swings, etc. You see that in the chisel type of Nasser engine, you had this chisel seems to go toward upwards as well, right? So there was some further force to be applied, at least by those who were swinging it, and it had to weight still kind of more on the internal. And the rest of the crew would be made up of the aforementioned archers, an officer that supervised the entire crew. So you have again the ladler, assuming just one guy, and then at least 4 guys operating these multiple rams, as it seems, with the different spears. We don't know how they were, if they were operated like they were hinged all at a single ram. It's unlikely that they operated separately, likely. And this is interesting because it makes it actually more complicated in the lighter types. In any case, the Assyrian siege capacities, as we've seen, were quite advanced. Pioneers accompanied the army. Rivers were crossed by means of inflated animal skins that could support individual swimming soldiers. We have evidence of this. The guys are swimming naked normally, and the rest of the material was, or other men and animals, by the way, were transported by rafts that were supported by the same inflated animal skins put together. Right, horses could also be swum across depending on the type of fording spot, while unharnessed chariots were transported by means of the kelek, that was kind of a large round boat made of probably also in here of wicker work, covered with a water weight material, and just with oars, with a paddle, something, and covered. The cover was mostly hides, as you understand, stretched over a frame. And these were the means fundamentally were used to move the Assyrian army across rivers against cities, maybe at the same time as we've seen also with the floating siege towers. And just to conclude on the overall picture, let's say not just the siege engine parts scorporated from the rest of the army in this doctrinal sense, anachronistically speaking, we can look at the lattice reliefs from again, as we said before, 701 BC of Sennacherib, where the Assyrians are depicted having built 2 siege ramps with 10 paved tracks for 7 siege engines, right? And the Assyrian soldiers are attacking the walls under cover of the siege engines. Naturally, there are, we hinted at before, there are instances in which there are no siege engines. There are just ladders that were used naturally, prominently as the most effective mean to climb, to assault the enemy walls. And in this scene, in any case, we see altogether, and this naturally doesn't necessarily give us a concrete proportion of what the type of troops were. It's just an artistic depiction, but can give us an idea of how important these elements were. We see 8 auxiliary archers, 16 auxiliary spearmen, 8 armored slingers, which is interesting because normally slingers were kind of not necessarily throwaway troops, but somewhat, in many ways, the cheapest one you could find. In many contexts, these guys are armored. We've seen it in video, in fact, of the Neo-Assyrian infantry. As to say, well, the importance of missiles was great, right? And to have properly armored, maybe these were also kind of assault troops in other contexts, in the same context, but maybe in another moment. Let's say it's not depicted in here, but they're present. 26 armored archers as well, plus 6 on the siege engines themselves. Then we have 12 armored archers with shield bearers coupled. Right, so the aforementioned proportion that we've seen there, and again here also is very interesting numerically the ratio of 26 armored archers as opposed to also just to the one together with the shield bearers next to them. Are basically almost the same number of troops, except half of the archers, if not even less actually, of the unarmored type. So this speaks of an interesting direct involvement of missile troops also under fire of some sort, for which they were armored. It is understandable that the number of unarmored auxiliary archers, that is 8, decreases as the siege advances towards the walls, right? Because at that point these troops are more vulnerable, right? While in fact the number of armored archers, that is 44 altogether, increases. I'm adding to the 32 also the armored slingers, and here I'm maybe miscounting something, but it's altogether that important proportion. So of course the more armored troops came closer to the enemy walls. There are 16 spearmen as well, as we've seen, that were to carry out an important role in close combat on the top of the ramparts after breaking through the walls, evidently. But that is also, after all, contained altogether, again, in comparison to the missiles. But for Assyrian warfare, that is normal, especially at this point in time, to have that larger amount of missile troops. In any case, for more of that, you can check the other videos I made. I created a playlist, yes, about Assyrian warfare and army, and so this is pretty much it. So you understand it's simple yet effective, but also costly for the times standards military engineering that was really at the top of the time and probably was functionalized in much more effective ways than we usually think. Siege warfare didn't really change conceptually much historically, like warfare altogether, so very often the interaction of these means was kind of much more elementary than you think. The problem was having the means to maintain that, and especially the type of troops that knew how to functionalize their employment. So experienced troops that had seen it all before because they had already participated to other campaigns. It could be compensated not just through loot but through further distribution of land, places of power, and also the same equipment that very often was just by itself extremely valuable and would make the the troop even more cohesive and qualitative in the process. We will talk again about Neo-Assyrian warfare. For today, however, stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.